Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. The hearing will begin shortly. May I remind you to check your mobile phones or any other electrical equipment you have with you are on silent mode. Members of the public and reporters in the hearing room are not permitted to use any electronic devices during the hearing. If you wish to do this, you can do so in the annex. No food or drink may be consumed in the hearing room except for water provided. Thank you.
Weeks, the response by state agencies to the Salisbury and Amesbury incidents has been scrutinised by this inquiry. Whatever criticisms might be made of those agencies, including Wiltshire Police, are in a different league entirely to the criticisms due of the Skripal's attackers and those who instructed them. On behalf of the Chief Constable, we will make some overview points on the key themes touching upon Wiltshire Police's involvement following the chronology. Cross-referenced written submissions will be filed in due course.
Please.
First, the Salisbury incident. Prior to the 4th of March 2018, Wiltshire Police had no record of Mr. Skripal on its systems, save for the usual driver's details. What information existed on Mr. Skripal? What, if anything, should have been shared with Wiltshire Police? And what difference any of that might have made are matters for closed submissions. What can be said in open, and what Deputy Chief Constable Mills said in his evidence, is that had Wiltshire Police known about Mr. Skripal's status on the evening of the 4th of March, it would have enabled officers to move more quickly. But not that much more quickly, because in the event, Counter-Terrorism Police, CTP, were involved from an investigative perspective from around 9 o'clock the following morning when they indicated they were appointing a senior investigating officer. Turning to the Maltings and the Salisbury incident, following the call to Wiltshire Police at 4:17 p.m. on the 4th of March about a male and a female collapsed in the Maltings, officers arrived in less than 10 minutes. 2 casualties were being cared for by off-duty medics, who were soon joined by paramedics. Officers erected cordons, obtained Mr. Skripal's details from his driver's licence, and assisted the paramedics where requested. The Skripals left for the hospital at 4:52 p.m. Detectives also made their way to the Maltings. The scene there was secured, as was Mr. Skripal's home at 47 Christie Miller Road. Mr. Skripal's car was found locked in the Maltings car park. Thinking that the incident was a possible fentanyl poisoning, contact was made with the National Poisons Information Service. CBRN tactical advice was sought and ultimately obtained from VN 005. A little after 8 p.m, Detective Constable called Wilby performed an open source search on Mr. Skripal, which returned material suggesting that he was a former Russian spy. This put a different complexion on the incident. Contact was properly made with the Southwest Counter-Terrorism Investigative Unit, which had no record of Mr. Skripal. Firearms officers were deployed to the hospital. Mr. Mills, the on-call chief officer, was briefed. In addition to local CBRN advice from VN 005, Superintendent Corner sought and obtained advice from the National CBRN Centre. Through them, he spoke with a number of scientists. At 2:40 in the morning of the 5th of March 2018, the Skripal's home was searched by Detective Inspector Mant, Detective Sergeant Bailey, and Officer VN 005. They were looking for further casualties or anything that might cast light on the circumstances in which the Skripals had fallen ill. Mr. Mant and Mr. Corner both deemed the search to be necessary. The search was done in what was considered to be the best PPE available to the police at the time. The precise PPE used had been discussed between VN 005 and a senior scientific advisor at DSTL GW66. Nothing was found in the search, but by one means or another, it is clear that DS Bailey became contaminated with Novichok, as did PC Bell. In PC Bell's case, that was probably when he was handed back his body-worn camera or his torch that had been borrowed by the search officers. In terms of these initial actions, Commander Murphy's evidence was that Wiltshire Police did a very good job of that initial stage of the investigation, both in terms of its initial response and in terms of the specialist response that followed, and that the search of the house, for the reasons articulated by D.I. Mant, was absolutely the right thing to do, noting that specialist advice had been taken. As we have mentioned, CTP appointed an SIO on the 5th of March, and the handover to CTP from Wiltshire then began. Wiltshire Police's focus then turned to providing resources for the wider policing operation and to consequence management. Turning then to the period in between Salisbury and Amesbury, Wiltshire Police's consequence management work was done in partnership with other members of the Local Resilience Forum, or LRF. The LRF is a creature of the Civil Contingencies Act 2004. It operated through a Strategic Coordination Group, or SCG, and a Tactical Coordination Group, or TCG. At its height, that structure coordinated the involvement of some 26 partner agencies. They were chaired in the first, or response phase, by senior Wiltshire police officers, the SCG by Mr. Mills and the TCG by Superintendent Minty. They were advised by a Standing Scientific and Technical Advisory Cell, or STAC, led by the Deputy Director of the Regional Arm of Public Health England, PHE. They were also advised by the National Health Emergency Response Cell, or HERC. The SCG and TCG met almost daily until they were stood down by agreement on the 23rd of March. In the second, or recovery phase, the leadership passed to Wiltshire Council, but the police remained very much involved in the effort. It is Wiltshire Police's assessment but of course it is a matter for you, sir, that the LRF structure worked well on the whole. And that is so even when the added complexity is taken into account, that the local police force was not conducting the criminal investigation, and critical parts of that investigation, that is CTP's investigation, were being carried out on a strict need-to-know basis. The inquiry has focused on two issues between Salisbury and Amesbury: public health warnings and guidance to officers. As for public health warnings, the recollection of everyone who has given evidence to this inquiry, except Dame Sally Davis, is that the "do not pick it up unless you dropped it" advice was not given to the public until after the Amesbury incident. The basic facts that could have prompted such advice, that there may have been discarded nerve agent in Salisbury or elsewhere in the UK, and that the nerve agent was lethal, were known to and understood by PHE, Dame Sally, and in the Department of Health from around mid-March. We heard evidence from V13A that a decision could have been made that it was not proportionate to give the "do not pick it up" advice that was clearly being considered by PHE. What we have not seen yet is a record of a proportionality decision actually being taken, or indeed a formal scientific risk assessment underpinning such a decision. Public health warnings were a matter for PHE, first locally or regionally, and then nationally. Mr. Mills recalls it being made clear to him early on that Salisbury was to be a nationally run public health incident. The public health documents adduced by the inquiry bear out the fact that the public health decisions were being made on a national level. PHE had highly qualified staff and indeed behavioural scientists to determine the proportionality, content and timing of public health advice based on their expertise as to public health risks, mitigations and messaging. PHE sat on the SCG and advised it via the stack. Standing items on the SCG's agenda were current public health risks, both generally and to responders. Mr. Mills, as chair of the SCG, was assured that the extant public health measures were sufficient. Mr. Mills did, however, accept that, on reflection, he could have been more probing of PHE about issuing "do not pick it up" advice. But given that Dame Sally herself had raised the issue of discarded nerve agent at a national level, and given the conclusions of Sir John Aston's review, it seems most unlikely that Mr. Mills doing so would have made any difference. As for guidance to officers, the inquiry has understandably asked what guidance was given to officers in between the Salisbury and Amesbury incidents about the signs and symptoms of nerve agent poisoning. On the 13th of March, a nationally produced poster about the IOR remove guidance was, we believe, circulated by Wiltshire Police to all officers. On the 27th of March, a CTP and National CBRN Centre produced slide deck was circulated by Wiltshire Police to all officers. That culminated in a version of the IOR remove poster, which had been updated to include the symptoms of hazardous substance exposure. At around the same date, a CTP and National CBRN Centre produced advice note for CBRN commanders and advisors was circulated by Wiltshire Police to the officers in those roles. It came with restrictions on wider distribution. It included guidance on the symptoms of nerve agent exposure, the so-called CRESS, which was already in the CBRN Advisor's Handbook, as we saw during VN 005's evidence. The CRESS was not circulated to all officers. Mr. Mills's evidence was that, on reflection, it would have been better to have done so, and he could have pushed back on the distribution restrictions. That observation was made in the context of there potentially being discarded Novichok at large in Wiltshire. While your counsel established with both Mr. Mills and Mr. Murphy that there was no secrecy or sensitivity around the cress. At the time, that level of detail on symptoms was simply not provided in national CBRN guidance to officers who did not require specialist CBRN training. The national position was reflected both in Wiltshire Police and in CTP. CBRN guidance is, for understandable reasons, prepared on a national basis by CBRN experts, and they no doubt applied logic to the level of information to be given to frontline officers versus specialists. In all events, by January 2023, the national CBRN thinking had shifted. National guidance was produced by Jessup, which did include the cress. This new guidance formed the basis for officer safety training to all Wiltshire Police officers from early 2023. We now turn to the Amesbury incident. At around 10:14 a.m. on the 30th of June 2018, the ambulance service received a call that a female, who turned out to be Dawn, was in respiratory arrest at 9 Muggleton Road. Wiltshire Police was not informed or asked to attend and did not learn of Dawn's collapse until after it was mentioned in the call from the ambulance service to the police about Charlie Rowley's collapse at 7:02 p.m. Wiltshire Police was informed of Charlie's collapse in an earlier call just before 7 o'clock from the fire service. A standard check on police systems revealed warning markers for the 9 Muggleton Road address, including drugs, and significant drugs intelligence relating to Charlie. The Force Incident Manager, who is based in the control room, Inspector Noble, decided to deploy officers to the scene. It is accepted that the ambulance service said at 7:13 p.m. that the patient's symptoms were similar to Salisbury and asked for cords to be put up. That was said before the police were on scene and when the fire service had just arrived, so co-located Jessup decision-making had not been possible. Mr. Noble made an assessment at 7:19 p.m, which was recorded on the CAD. He declined cordons at that time. He described the ambulance service's concerns as understandable, but noted the drugs information, which it appears the ambulance service did not have. He considered that provided the most likely explanation. He asked for a police supervisor to attend to assess the scene, applying the IOR 123 guidance before assuming the worst and causing huge disruption with cordons, etc. Shortly before 7:30 p.m, Detective Sergeant Laws made for Salisbury District Hospital to establish or confirm the female patient's identity and to see if the doctor's assessment of her condition might cast light on what was happening at Muggleton Road. Back at the Muggleton Road scene, when Acting Sergeant McCurley arrived just before 7:30 p.m, as instructed, he wanted to obtain more information before deciding to close roads. He crossed the cordon first to speak to Sam Hobson as a potential witness before entering the property. Mr. McCurley's evidence was that he was not able to identify who the ambulance or fire commanders on scene were before he crossed the cordon. We accept that he should have waited to speak with them, in line with Jessup. Mr. McCurley acknowledged that he could have tried to find a way of making radio contact with the emergency medical technicians, or EMTs, treating Charlie before entering the property. In any event, he was aware that the EMTs thought that Charlie's symptoms were similar to those displayed at Salisbury. But he was also aware, having been told by Mr. Noble, about drugs intelligence with respect to the property and people associated with it. And he was aware that Charlie was a drugs user whose previous partner had died of a drugs overdose, and that Sam Hobson was a drug user. He agreed with Mr. Noble's hypothesis that this was likely to be some sort of drugs overdose. As Mr. McCurley told you, in addition to the intelligence, his considerations were that this was an incident occurring some months after Salisbury, 7 to 8 miles away, involving known local people with no obvious connection to Russia. Inside the property, Mr. McCurley was told by EMT Ben Channon that Charlie's symptoms were consistent with the Salisbury incident. Mr. McCurley said that the police were under the impression that it was a drugs overdose. Mr. Channon's written evidence was that Mr. McCurley referred to drugs intelligence on the address, but he could not remember that in his oral evidence. Whatever he said, Mr. McCurley certainly did not intend to be quite dismissive, as Mr. Channon described him in his written evidence. He has apologised if that is how he came across. He searched for and found drugs paraphernalia, syringes and sharp spins. In a later search, Duty Inspector Beresford Smith also found spoons associated with drug taking. 2 points arise. Should the police have given drugs information to the ambulance staff? And did giving that information, or the police's approach generally, make any difference to Charlie's care? To the first point, relaying the drugs intelligence was entirely appropriate. The intelligence was correct and was later proved to be correct from the heroin levels in Charlie's blood and from Sam Hobson's evidence about Charlie taking heroin on the day he fell ill. It was clearly something that was relevant to Charlie's treatment. We know that because the possibility of drugs was considered relevant by the ambulance service. The EMTs actively considered the possibility of drugs. An ambulance service supervisor asked the EMTs to search for drugs paraphernalia, and the ambulance service's formal record transferred to the emergency department, something they have emphasised the importance of, provided the history, no drugs paraphernalia present initially, drug use was denied by the occupant. To the second point, the police's actions did not make any difference to Charlie's treatment. Mr. Channon said that they were already providing treatment for opioid overdose and nerve agent exposure to cover both bases, as he put it. The expert, Mr. Faulkner, suggested essentially that it was fortunate that the EMTs stuck to their guns in light of what the police were saying. The premise of this comment appears not to have been the police giving drugs intelligence, but the tone in which the expert understood it to have been given. In any event, the treatment for nerve agent exposure, atropine, had been given to Charlie at 7 p.m. and 7:23 p.m. That was before Mr. McCurley even arrived at the scene. The management of casualties is always a matter for the ambulance service, in law and applying the 2016 Jessup CBRM principles. The police did not interfere with Charlie's treatment. In fact, they assisted by taking Charlie out of the property, Mr. McCurley even driving the ambulance to hospital. The control of the scene and the response is ultimately a matter for the police applying the 2016 Jessup CBRM principles. When he arrived, Mr. Beresford Smith had a joint meeting with the ambulance and fire leaders, as required by Jessup. Mr. Mills has accepted that the officers were overly confident about the drugs hypothesis and that greater heed should have been paid to the views of the ambulance service in line with Jessup. But by the time the CBRN incident was stood down, Mr. Beresford Smith had more than the drugs intelligence and the ambulance service's assessment to go on. He understood from DS Laws that Dr. Jukes at the hospital was satisfied that Dawn's symptoms were in line with the drugs overdose. The disagreement between the police and the ambulance service was in any event only relevant for a short period of time. The ambulance service's involvement ended when Charlie's care passed to the hospital at 9:11 p.m. And in terms of public safety, Charlie's house was left secured and the keys taken to the hospital. Going back a little in time to what happened at the hospital. DS Laws went to the hospital to see if anything about Dawn's treatment would cast light on Charlie's condition. She arrived there at 7:50 p.m. DS Laws' evidence was that she gave Dr. Jukes the drugs intelligence about Charlie and not about Dawn. Dr. Jukes' evidence was that he recalled DS Laws receiving information about DS Laws giving information about Charlie. He did not recall her saying anything about Dawn. His text message to FT49 at 8:05 p.m. reads, "CID have just told me they have evidence of drug use at the house." And FT49's evidence was that in a later phone call, Dr. Jute said that a recreational drug user and his partner had been admitted to the ITU, and that the drug user in question must have been Charlie Rowley. Whatever information DS Laws provided was given with the best of motives to ensure that Dawn received appropriate treatment. DS Laws is criticised for not passing all the information that police held on Dawn that pointed towards and away from a drugs hypothesis. It is said that she should have passed on the negative PNC and the lack of intelligence that Dawn was a drug user. DS Law's evidence was that she was not told of the absence of intelligence. She accepts, as does the force, that it would have been best for the fullest information to have been obtained and provided to the hospital. But the fullest of information would have included the welter of evidence beyond that which DS Laws shared in support of the drugs hypothesis, which we'll come to in a moment. DS Laws is also criticised for not relaying what the ambulance service had said about another Salisbury. Her evidence is that she did say that there were concerns at the scene that the symptoms being presented were similar to the previous nerve agent poisoning. But in any event, it appears that Dr. Jukes was already aware about there being a suspicion of nerve agent at 9 Muggleton Road. We say that because at 7:52 p.m, Dr. Jukes sent his first text message to FT49 asking who to contact to do some ACH levels and saying that hazard suits had been mentioned. Finally, the note timed 9:15 p.m. by Dr. Russell recording a conversation with Dr. Zavori at 7:45 p.m. in which the patients were described as known IVDUs. Yeah. That was shortly before DS Laws arrived at the hospital, which was at 7:50. The intelligence on Dawn was not relayed to DS Laws over the radio until 8:15 p.m. There is no evidence before the inquiry of Dr. Zavori speaking to any police officer, and we cannot take that matter any further. I now turn to the reference in police documents, including DS Law's handover to Charlie and Dawn being two known drug users. That was correct in the case of Charlie, but it was not correct in the case of Dawn. Deputy Chief Constable Mills, on behalf of the force, and DS Laws, who included those words in police documents, have both sincerely apologised. It should never have happened. There is no evidence that this misstatement of the intelligence had any impact on the police investigation or Dawn's medical treatment. Both the police and doctors had the effects of drug use as leading hypotheses. That would most likely have been the same had the intelligence been stated accurately and fully, namely that Dawn was not a known drug user, Charlie was a known drug user and dealer, Dawn was associated with Charlie, there was recent intelligence about their association with drugs, both had fallen ill at an address associated with drugs, and the police had found drugs paraphernalia at that address. In terms of DS Martin's briefing to the SCG on the 3rd of July, in which she repeated the two known drugs users line, her evidence was that she was relaying how the matter had been first presented, namely what was stated incorrectly in DS Laws' first handover email. But the key point here is that this SCG was being called because DSTL had confirmed Novichok poisoning to a very high degree of confidence. So there is no question of the police going down a blind alley following misstated intelligence. We deal briefly with the press statement authorised by DS Martin for release a day earlier on the 2nd of July 2018, because this is the public statement that we understand the family say generated a media narrative about Dawn being a drug user. You heard from DS Martin. In asking for a press release to be issued, she was acting with the very best of intentions. She knew that Charlie and Dawn's treating clinicians were considering the possibility that they had taken drugs cut with a poisonous substance. She also knew the details of a particular piece of recent intelligence about Charlie and Dawn's association with drugs, and that Charlie was a known drug user and dealer. Giving precautionary public advice to the vulnerable drug-using community was entirely appropriate. In other circumstances that are not hard to contemplate, our client would no doubt be facing strong criticism at an inquest for failing to give precautionary advice of the very kind given by DS Martin. As far as the content of the press release goes, the line of concern appears to be, at this stage, we believe the two patients have fallen ill after using from a contaminated batch of drugs, possibly heroin or crack cocaine. That was what the police reasonably believed at the time. It was not intended to traduce Dawn's character. Dawn was not named, and it would not be realistic to add riders about the police not having intelligence that one of the patients was a drug user. Turning to the early investigative actions in the Amesbury incident. As the inquiry has heard, initial investigative actions were carried out by DS Law's and DS Martin's teams to try and find out where Charlie and Dawn had been and who they had been with. A number of people were spoken to, both to check on their welfare and to obtain their accounts. Assistance was provided to the hospital in getting blood tests done, and both Charlie and Dawn's addresses were secured. The police's initial hypothesis was of a drugs overdose, moving to an overdose of drugs cut with pesticide when doctors' thinking moved. We will not labour the basis for that hypothesis, but we do say it is striking that the ITU team treating Dawn and Charlie had recently, and uniquely in the UK, dealt with cases of Novichok poisoning and had been involved in post-incident learning. And even they did not consider these initially to be clear and obvious cases of nerve agent poisoning. We say that not to be critical of the hospital, and indeed your experts, Dr. Saw and Professor Nolan, are not critical of the hospital care. We say it to put into context the criticism made of the police's initial hypothesis, and indeed the references to what are said to have been obvious symptoms of nerve agent poisoning, also called litmus tests. Once nerve agent poisoning was confirmed on the 3rd of July, the matter was handed over to CTP, who formally took primacy the next day. The SCG structure was stood up on the 3rd of July. It operated, we respectfully suggest, operated effectively until the 5th of July 2018, when the response phase came to an end. As before, the recovery phase was led by the council, with police assisting in the effort. Turning to causation. In Dawn's case, the medical and expert evidence is clear. Her injuries were, tragically, unsurvivable by around 10:33 on the 30th of June. That is 8.5 hours before Wiltshire Police was even informed of her collapse. Any errors by the police thereafter were of no causal significance. There are two other causation questions that the inquiry is likely to consider. Whether the discarded bottle might have been discovered by the police earlier, and whether earlier do not pick it up advice might have made a difference. As for the searches were part of CTP's criminal investigation. Mr. Asman was assisted, as he told you, by a senior search advisor from the NCA and from Wiltshire Police, and he had a briefing from MI5. In our submission, this inquiry has heard nothing that could realistically gainsay the search strategy or its execution. The strategy reacted to the developing evidential picture, taking account of the need for the search activity to be carefully prioritised as it was being undertaken in challenging CBRN conditions. Even if it could realistically be suggested that the search should have been faster or wider, that would only be relevant if the inquiry could first establish where and when Charlie picked up the bottle as a basis for a suggestion that the police should have got to it first. Charlie Rowley was unable to give real evidence, although even if he had, a number of factors tell against the hypothesis that he found the bottle in the bins behind cancer research a day or so before giving it to Dawn. It seems rather more likely that he found it in the hours after the Skripal's attackers had deposited it in an unknown location in Salisbury before 1:40 p.m. on the 4th of March. What we do know is that Charlie frequently searched through a variety of bins in a variety of locations in Salisbury for items of value. On the 11th of March, when he tried to cross the police's cordon at the Bishop's Mill pub in order to get to the bins there, he told PC Osmond that this was how he earned a living. Bins, we know, are emptied on a regular basis, and Mr. Murphy's assessment was that Charlie appeared to have been bin dipping in the evening of the 4th of March, including around Brown Street car park, where Petrov and Borisov may have been just hours before. As for the public health advice, it might be said that if the do not pick it up advice had been given earlier, Charlie might not have picked up the bottle, or might not have given it to Dawn, or if he had, she might not have accepted it. The public health messaging is a matter for PHE. But even if do not pick it up advice should have been given earlier, for that to be relevant, the inquiry would have to conclude that Charlie would have connected the advice to a bottle he'd already picked up. He did the advice, or told Dawn where he found the bottle, or that she would have connected the advice to the bottle, or that she'd have heeded the advice. And that involves many layers of speculation. In terms of lessons learnt, Wiltshire Police participated in a national learning debrief organised by the College of Policing and has implemented its recommendations. Inevitably, there have been changes and improvements over the last 6 years in any event. We made clear in opening the Chief Constable's commitment to learning any further lessons that arise from this inquiry. Work is already underway to ensure that learning captured through the inquiry's hearings and that may be identified in your report, sir, can be translated into swift improvements to Wiltshire Police's service to the public. In conclusion, we repeat, on behalf of the Chief Constable, our condolences to Dawn's family and friends, and recognise the consequences of the poisonings for the Skripals, Detective Sergeant Bailey, Police Constable Bell, and Charlie Rowley, and also the impact they had on all those who responded to the incidents and on the people of Salisbury. And so it remains for me to thank your team, both those here and elsewhere, who have ensured that these hearings have concluded efficiently and safely. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Barrett. Mr. Allen.
Not in a million years would I have thought about chemical poisoning in Salisbury. Those observations from Miss Wood perhaps quite eloquently sum up the position of all of those involved in these events. No one who has so far provided evidence to this inquiry had anticipated the extraordinary incidents that unfolded in Salisbury and Amesbury in 2018. And as Dr. Haslam has put it himself in the article he wrote in the British Journal of Anaesthesia, for the average anaesthetist, tales of human nerve agent poisoning are the subject of elaborate blockbuster movies, something that happens elsewhere. Unfortunately for Dawn and her family, this is not a movie. It's real life. It happened to them and it happened in Salisbury, and we are still, as we said before, so sorry that it's your family that have been through this. Thankfully, sir, the likelihood of these circumstances happening again in Salisbury is very slim. But as the South Western Ambulance Service Foundation Trust said at the very outset of these hearings, it doesn't mean that the public services in Wiltshire or anywhere else can be complacent. So you've heard a lot from others about the facts of the evidence that you've heard. Much of what SWAFT wish to address with you is looking at the third part of your terms of reference, the term of reference that requires you to make recommendations as seem appropriate. Because an essential part of any public inquiry is to explore and reflect upon events, determine whether any learning can be taken forward for the future. And even unparalleled as they were, the events that unfolded in Salisbury and Amesbury, even if never repeated, can have learning from those landmark experiences that can be extrapolated to other situations, not just chemical weapons or chemical poisoning, elsewhere in the UK. And the NHS, which is an ever-evolving entity, has ability to adapt and a capacity to embed learning if positive change is to be achieved. SWAFT have that commitment to learning, and we hope that's enabled at SWAFT to cultivate a culture that we're proud of, and we hope has been demonstrated through the course of these events by the proactive steps taken to implement learning. But we are committed to further learning and working alongside our partners, and we will enact any recommendations made with a view to keeping the public that we serve as practicably safe as possible. As I said, sir, I won't dwell on any of the facts because, frankly, not many of the facts seem to be in dispute between the witnesses. But look forward at recommendations and changes that might be considered for the future, and also look at what has been done. SWAFT take the process of learning very seriously. We have an embedded process of debriefing lessons and processes in place to support organisational and multi-agency learning at all levels. In the case of Salisbury and Amesbury incidents, this included scenario-based learning, continuous professional development, and sessions for the key roles across the Trust, and also multi-agency debriefs that took place under the Local Resilience Forum umbrella, and guidance was disseminated. So you will recall Mr. Darch in the first week of this inquiry told you about some of the learning disseminated between March 2018 and July 2018. Following the extraordinary events in Salisbury in March, SWAFT did quickly identify the need to ensure that staff were appraised of any revisions to national guidance, both the CBRM guidance as well as the existing guidance. All guidance was shared with staff by email, and staff involved in the incidents in Salisbury were invited to learning events and debrief meetings. And you recall how Mr. Darch also attended the National Ambulance debrief with lessons identified and shared that with the National Ambulance Resilience Unit, that's NERU, you'll hear spoken of. And they were disseminated nationally. There was also attendance at Public Health England events in April 2018. And that was with the aim of helping everybody with an opportunity to reflect on those experiences, share the learning and educate others. So we can remind you of the guidance that was cascaded down by SWAFT to all members of frontline staff between March and the end of June. Some of it wasn't strictly intended for the ambulance sector, but all information received was considered salient, and early dissemination was seen as an important thing to do, whoever the guidance had been written for. So clinical guidance that Public Health England had issued to emergency departments and general practitioners was actually handed by SWAFT to its ambulance personnel. The duodote medicine protocol was reissued by SWAFT. The Home Office inter-operational response to CBRM incidents and the steps 1, 2, 3 was all reissued, and guidance from the National CBRN Centre was given to the control room, which included the signs and symptoms of chemical poisoning. NHS England, before Dawn was poisoned, had already issued NHS Pathways important information, nerve agent release guidance, and that was issued to the SWAFT emergency operations centres and the NHS 111 service in Dorset. And the Public Health England public advice leaflet was also issued internally, although again that advice leaflet was targeted at members of the public who may have attended the specific locations in Salisbury in March 2018. Against all of that background, SWAFT rewrote its internal major incident plan, and that was reviewed and updated by April 2018. But, sir, you will also have heard during the evidence of errors by SWAFT staff. During the course of Sergei Skipal's treatment, there was a significant drug error that occurred. Mr. Skripal was erroneously administered atropine rather than naloxone, which had been intended to reverse what the paramedics considered might be an opiate overdose. Although this error was somewhat fortuitous in hindsight, given the reversing effect of atropine upon nerve agent poisoning, SWAFT still recognised this was nonetheless a significant drug error of the wrong drug being given to a patient, or the drug not intended to be given. But it is important to note that on identifying that error, the paramedic involved followed the Trust's incident reporting process. He brought it to the attention of management and discussed it with them, and it was ensured that the hospital were notified. That paramedic also engaged in self-reflection afterwards. But SWAFT are not complacent, and we are continually seeking to learn, and we have taken that learning into account to take positive action to reduce medication errors through guidance, policy, and scenario-based training. Turning then, sir, to the learning and training after July 2018. You may feel that the learning methods adopted by SWAFT between the two incidents were effective, if demonstrated by the actions of those who attended Charlie, who quickly and correctly identified the signs and symptoms of nerve agent poisoning. They had not been at the Skripals incident, although some witnesses seem a bit confused about whether they had or not. Neither Mr. Channon nor Mr. Martin had attended the Skripals incident.
No, but Mr. Parsons had, and he came later, is that right?
Mr. Parsons, who attended after Mr. Channon and Mr. Martin, had made the call,
Yes.
essentially. Mr. Parsons, who actually never saw Charlie as a patient as such,
Yep.
but spoke with his colleagues, and hearing his colleagues' rationale for why they believed it could be a nerve agent poisoning, then endorsed what they said.
That's right.
In recognition of the risks and the need to equip staff with all possible guidance after July 2018, debrief meetings were held and lessons were learned again. SWAFT attended meetings across the UK. It has not just been southern based. Learning was again shared with the National Ambulance Resilience Unit, where all the English ambulance services were present at that meeting, and there was further learning taken forward into Europe at the European CBRNE conferences. There were a number of documents circulated to staff at SWAFT after Amesbury, particularly again further updated Public Health England guidance, which again contains the signs and symptoms of nerve agent poisoning, and did consider the differential diagnosis. And there are internal documents from IMARCH, which again support emergency service in the management of incidents. And yet again, SWAFT reissued the medicines protocol for duodote. But sir, I mean, given these events are not local, and if an event like this happens again, the likelihood of it being in Salisbury must be slim. You will be concerned to know about the wider learning nationally, independent of SWAFT. Yeah? The national guidance for the ambulance sector was, as Mr. Berry has already alluded to, updated in 2023. The JR Calc was updated. The section on the use of duodote as an antidote for nerve agent poisoning was updated, and there's a dedicated section now on the CRESS. What CRESS is that clinical assessment tool that requires clinicians to consider consciousness, respiration, eyes, secretion and skin when they're doing their clinical assessment. It's a particular use for looking at likely signs and symptoms of nerve agent or cyanide or opiate or atropine or sepsis or even heat stroke when you're in the pre-hospital environment. Secondly, sir, the PHE major incident guidelines were actually quite rapidly updated in 2018 to include a revised section on the CBRNE response, and it was that which allowed SWAFT itself to update its own CBRNE plan. To reinforce the guidance issued and the education shared locally, SWAFT now asks staff to all complete mandatory development training on an annual basis, in addition to e-learning packages relating to CBRNE and initial operational response, the IOR. Following both the Salisbury and Amesbury incidents, SWAF has been and continues to be involved in sharing lessons at national and international conferences. And that's included the clinical signs and symptoms of neurotoxic poisoning, as well as detailed learning from our own response and the consequence management in terms of the multi-agency arrangements. Thirdly, there's been updates to the national IOR response to incidents where it is suspected there's a hazardous substance of any sort, not just Novichok, and that was issued following the incidents by the national GESIP team to all emergency services. This update includes safety critical considerations for responders, but with the golden thread of life-saving activity at the heart. Actually, since these events, there's been a removal of the 1, 2, 3 plus step you heard so much about that had assisted with the diagnosis in Charlie's case, but that approach has been replaced through the emergency services with the RAR approach, as it's called, the recognise, assess and react approach. The position now with SWAFT is that the application of GESIP results in all frontline emergency operations centre staff receiving annual training and an increase in the training of commanders as well. The ambulance commanders have a regular multi-agency training and exercise opportunities, as well as the individual ones linked to SWAFT. And our emergency operations centres also participate in multi-agency control room exercises on a monthly basis with our police and fire and rescue partners throughout the year. So much has changed in the 6 years since 2018. And if or when another not in a million years event happens, we hope you will find that the country as a whole, not just the Southwest, is now more prepared for dealing with such an incident. Looking to the future, there is at the moment a plan for the National Health Service Executive, NHS England, National Health, NHSE, to conduct a national review of CBRN capabilities across the NHS. That's underway alongside the National Resilience Team who are conducting this, and it's a programme of activity focused on a clinical response to major incidents. In particular, sir, any recommendation from this inquiry, we understand, will be considered as part of those work streams in the NHS as well. And with that in mind, sir, there are a couple of specific topics that have come out of this inquiry that we would like to draw to your attention. The first is the application of GESIP and collaborative working. You've heard a lot about it, the Joint Emergency Services Interoperability Principles. It's a programme that's there to improve how emergency services work together. It was established in 2012 to improve the multi-agency response and coordinate with very simple principles. When you have a number of organisations involved, you need to co-locate, communicate, coordinate, and have a joint understanding of the risk and a shared situational awareness. They're a good set of principles underlined by the joint decision model, which puts at the centre of that model a nationally agreed strategy of working together to save lives. GESIP, sir, was devised not for incidents like that which happened in Salisbury or Amesbury, but it's for routine incidents. It's there so organisations can work together cohesively in all phases of any incident, a spontaneous incident, a pre-planned incident, regardless of its scale. The classic is perhaps a crash on the motorway when police and ambulance and maybe fire are turning up, an explosion in a house, a stabbing in the street. All of those, and sadly every day, incidents like that happen, and all of those require JESIP to be used and put into action, regardless of the scale. It's not something special for Salisbury and Amesbury. So the geographical area covered by SWAFT is vast, and in that geographical area we work in partnership with 5 different police forces, including Wiltshire Police, and have a very strong working relationship between the blue light agencies. That's particularly required when JESIP is going to work effectively. There's a collaborative response, distinct roles played by everybody, but we have to ensure the best possible outcome by working together. And SWAFT want you to know that we do enjoy a strong and effective relationship with our partner agencies, including Wiltshire Police. The usual experience of SWAFT when they work with Wiltshire Police is that they do work faithfully to the JESIP principles. It's extremely unfortunate that that was not what happened in Salisbury and Amesbury, but that is not our normal experience. There were 3 core areas, though, where things did not work in accordance with JESIP at Salisbury and Amesbury. And the first, from the perspective of SWAFT, was the delay after the Salisbury incident in notification to partner agencies. As you've heard, police were aware that chemical poisoning was a potential cause of the Skripal's condition in the overnight period of Sunday the 4th of March into Monday the 5th of March. They were, the police, taking internal action to protect the health and welfare of their officers. SWAFT are concerned that that information was not shared with SWAFT for another 15 hours at least. That to SWAFT shows a breakdown of the JESIP principles in that incident. Remembering that it was SWAFT staff, as well as the nurse and the doctor who'd been passing as members of the public, who actually had hands-on with the patients, who, if somebody was at risk, were likely to have been the most at risk from a nerve agent poisoning. But it took 15 hours before SWAFT were notified. Information sharing being poor in that period could have, but we think thankfully didn't, result in ambulance staff or for becoming unwell or further risk to the public. The second shortcoming JESIP was that which I don't need to rehearse. It was what happened at the scene in Amesbury. It does appear to SWAFT that the response of some police officers at that time was lacking and there was no adherence to the JESIP principles. We don't think that's a flaw in the principles, though. As Mr. Faulkner told you, JESIP principles are really solid, well thought out principles, he said. I don't think they're fundamentally wrong. I think it's about how individuals choose to interpret it at the time. SWAFT agrees with Mr. Faulkner that the issue in this case was the sharing, learning and professional respect that is required between professionals. And in SWAFT's view, what happened at Amesbury was actually a failure to apply those good JESIP principles with appropriate professional respect. There should have been professional respect for the judgment of the paramedics. They were not emergency medicine technicians. They were fully qualified paramedics who were saying that Charlie appeared to have nerve agent poisoning. And that view of fully qualified paramedics was dismissed by both the police and Salisbury District Hospital staff. It's not unique to the police. Furthermore, a third thing happened. As we've heard in the evidence, the police hypothesis of opiate overdose changed to one of potential chemical nerve agent poisoning on the morning of Monday the 2nd of July. And again, there was another significant delay in the police coming back to the ambulance service and informing them that their working hypothesis had changed. SWAFT were not informed of this until after 9 o'clock on Tuesday the 3rd of July. That delay again presented a potential public health risk, not only the ambulance clinicians that attended the patients, but also the wider public. And sir, in this case, you will recall that...
Why did it present an additional risk to the public, in case there was another incident?
And the incident from both Dawn and Charlie had both now been conveyed in ambulances that were back in use, had not been decontaminated.
Oh, I see.
The ambulance staff, some of them had already gone home to their families.
Yeah.
With their uniforms potentially contaminated Novichok. And if the public includes every doctor, nurse and nursing assistant and porter in the hospital.
No, I thought I've got it.
And the difference here, sir, was, I mean, these were now two paramedics who had knowingly, to an extent, or believing this might be Novichok, put themselves at risk when they continued to treat Charlie. They had a belief, nobody else shared, that they might be putting their life at risk of doing it. They deserved the respect to be told, as soon as it did become a reality for other services, that they had been right, to permit them to take the precautions they may have wanted to take.
Right.
So there may be a question of why was it that it was so possible to identify the Novichok exposure of Charlie by those two particular ambulance staff. When SWAFT review the situation, we are heartened to see that the response by our staff to this incident was actually exactly what we'd have expected by them and expect from their training. Not just the two paramedics. This started with the actions of the emergency medical dispatchers, because those dispatchers had exceptional communication in recognising and passing on that this was the second person from the same address. That, of course, assists the paramedic who received that information. The identification of the potential nerve agent poisoning by Mr. Chan and Mr. Martin on the scene, and the escalation plans that were followed by the commanders on the scene were all, in our view, exactly what we would have expected them to do. And they did, alongside the fire service, escalate Jessup as it should have been. But we are concerned at the delays in passing on the information once it became apparent to the police. And we think learning must be taken from this day about sharing communication about potential chemical weapons across multi-agency partnerships. We do recognise that this was such an extraordinary situation that those in the know would have felt a need to be incredibly careful about the messaging that came out at that point, and would have needed to weigh up the potential of how they pass their message on, as one would expect in any national security or terrorism incident. But that should not have prevented them passing on the information to those who did need to know it. It should have been shared with the ambulance service, and it shouldn't have been decided for them that they didn't need to know. And we hope that that can be reflected on in the future, about how, when staff are at risk, the information that they will need to protect themselves is passed on.
Right.
But we must say that there have been, before and since 2018, multiple incidents where the application of Jessup and all three levels of the command structure has functioned successfully within the Wiltshire area and within our wider geographical area. And that has resulted in the safe and successful multi-agency resolution of incidents. There are another issue arising from the inquiry, sir. It's not been put forward to you much by the family in their closing submissions, but much of the questioning has been about the differentiating between drug overdose and nerve agent poisoning, put as if there is a binary approach to these two alternatives, which somehow should have been what was in everybody's mind, and even in the paramedics' mind. And SWAFT very strongly believe that the approach to this issue should never, ever be binary. To expect paramedics to approach a differential diagnosis as if they're conceptually comparing two binary alternatives it simply risks closing one's mind.
I haven't heard anybody suggest that they're binary, Mr. Owen. What
Well-
I've heard is repeated suggestions that there is an overlap.
Yes, well, we would agree with that, sir, but it appears that's been suggested it's an either or, and have you considered this? And the reality of the symptoms and the varied symptoms with which a patient might present means that promoting that idea where you compare and contrast only between opiate overdose and a nerve agent poisoning could be dangerous for the way that a paramedic must approach their job. Because, of course, what happened in Dawn's case, her first complaint was of a headache. As Professor Rutty told you, the source of her cardiac arrest that confronted the paramedics could have been a number of causes, with intracranial bleed, of course, being a brainstem hemorrhage or a stroke or some neurogenic event, being perhaps the most common. And what Dr. Haslam said to you is the role of a paramedic as a first responder is not to diagnose, not to actually make the decision between...
I think I've got all that, you know, Mr. Allen. Are you on recommendations that I ought to be considering making?
Thank you. Well, sir, if you're not considering making any recommendation about that, I'm happy to move on. So the other issue that we think has been some focus on in the inquiry and could benefit consideration is the concept of cognitive bias in approach. It's a topic, again, that's featured in many lines of questioning. Mm-hmm. Bias can never be eliminated from human decision making, of course, but it's training and raised awareness and experience of the risk of bias existing which will assist in mitigating that. And that is something we do at SWAFT. We have training on cognitive bias.
Yes, forgive me, I'm just trying to work out where I ought to put this in my notes, Mr. Allen. Is this a suggestion of a recommendation that you suggest
Yes.
that I ought to make?
Yes.
To whom?
Well, if, sir, you feel that there has been cognitive bias in the way that matters have been approached by others, and that cognitive bias training would help to reduce or eliminate the prospects of that happening, then it may be a recommendation you wish to consider.
Thank you very much.
It's something that we specifically have at SWAFT. We have education on bias incorporated into our face-to-face education. And we've had that for the past few years. And of course, there has been a lot of development in human factors and the impact that cognitive bias has on clinical decision making. And of course, one of the chief complaints of the family here is that once you hear that Dawn's boyfriend is a drug user or drug abuser, that sets up a cognitive bias and everybody sees it through that framework. And it may be that some approach that involves warning and training people about the risk of making assumptions based on one single piece of evidence is the way forward there.
I see. Thank you.
So the other thing that concerns staff, SWAFT, is to learn that the information SWAFT provided to the hospital did not seem to make its way to the treating clinicians. It's certainly not for SWAFT to tell the hospital how to pass on the information that is given to it. But if written information is going to be provided and appear in hospital records, SWAFT's view is that it would assist patient care, still recognising the doctors are the ones that do diagnosis in the end, not the paramedics, but it would assist patient care if it was considered and evaluated properly before doctors come to a view about whether to dismiss it or not. So, finally, can I conclude by moving from processes to people? Throughout the course of the inquiry, you have heard evidence from a number of SWAFT staff members who attended Sergei Mueller-Skripal and Dawn and Charlie, and those who gave evidence in person and others will have told you about the huge effect that this had on our staff. Many of the SWAFT staff were involved from emergency operations centre through to commanders, through to heart teams, and every member of staff involved in every element of the response has, to us, embodied the values SWAFT holds in high esteem of compassion, respect, professionalism and dignity. The emergency service personnel go to work each day to help people save lives, and they put themselves at risk. And one shouldn't underestimate the personal impact of these unprecedented events on all of our people. And finally, sir, can we turn our attention back to Dawn as the person at the centre of this inquiry and her family? At the outset, one of the principal concerns raised by Dawn's family was whether she was inappropriately treated as a drug user or whether this inadvertently affected her treatment. We hope through hearing the evidence from our clinicians and others, it's been realised that there was no point at which the SWAFT staff had a working diagnosis of drug overdose for Dawn. Their primary diagnosis was a neurological event, and they acted as they would for any patient in cardiac arrest where the cause is not immediately apparent.
Right.
A key question from her family has been, why did she die when others survive? And so we now know from the evidence you've heard that she was sadly probably beyond help when the SWAFT staff arrived. But we are nevertheless so sorry to her family that there was nothing we could do despite the best efforts. And we do hope for her family's sake that they, through this inquiry, can understand why it was that Dawn came to be taken from them, and that the process here can give them some answers and some closure that they so desperately deserve, so perhaps they can do what they've asked to and reminisce with a smile about Dawn and her life, and not everything be so focused on her death. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Ellen. I think you'd better have a break. But I suspect that probably the remaining submissions may not be very long. Is that right? Yes, all right. Well, 25 past, please. Yes, Mr. Herban? Yes.
Good afternoon, sir. Both Sergei and Yulia Skripal would like to express again their sorrow at the death of Dawn Sturgess and offer their deepest sympathies to her family and friends. The Skripals also express their sympathies to those who were injured in the course of the incidents. They would like to express their profound gratitude to the emergency workers, police and hospital staff who risked their lives to help them. Sergei and Yulia Skripal are grateful to this inquiry for its work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Herban. Ms. Wolfe.
The evidence the inquiry has heard has shown that the Russian state was responsible for the attack on Sergei and Yulia Skripal.
Yes.
Only Russia has the technical means, operational experience and motive. Great care has been taken with sensitive information in this inquiry because of the identity of those responsible for these events. It is important to emphasise that the last few months have represented only a part of the inquiry's work. The family of Dawn Sturgess have raised a number of questions that it has not been possible to explore in open. The inquiry has already made it clear that it will investigate thoroughly all relevant issues enclosed. Dawn Sturgess was the entirely innocent victim of the attempted murder of Sergei Skripal by agents of the Russian state. She was killed because those who attacked Mr. Skripal showed callous disregard, not only for his life and that of his daughter, but also for anyone else who might come into contact with the Novichok that was used. Echoing the submissions of the family this morning, in the government's submission, from the evidence you have received, you can be confident of the following. First, the weapon used in the attack on Mr. Skripal was a fourth-generation nerve agent of the class known as Novichoks, developed in the Soviet Union and inherited and further developed by the Russian Federation following the dissolution of the USSR. The same nerve agent, indeed the exact same batch of that nerve agent, caused the death of Dawn Sturgess and severe injury to Yulia Skripal, Charlie Rowley and Nick Bailey. Second, the Russian military intelligence officers from Unit 29155 of the GRU, Alexander Mishkin, Anatoly Chapiga, Denis Sergeyev, were responsible for carrying out the operation, using the aliases Alexander Petrov, Ruslan Bosharov, and Sergei Fedotov, respectively. Third, the different operations the GRU carried out in connection to Mr. Skripal indicate that the planned operation in March 2018 was known to and endorsed by the GRU's senior leadership. Fourth, there were clear geopolitical risks involved in this operation. Significant involvement and approval was required from the most senior levels, not just of the GRU, but of the Russian administration. And lastly, President Putin himself authorized the operation. The government is acutely conscious that the family have many other questions about these and other issues, which they have indicated they want to be explored. Today, the family have raised several of these, and they've raised some in writing and in Rule 10 applications in relation to the evidence of Commander Dominic Murphy, Jonathan Allen, and others. The government will provide every assistance to the inquiry team in closed proceedings as the inquiry considers these questions, including issues of preventability, such as those described by Mr. Mansfield. There is one aspect of preventability that it has been possible to explore fully and open, and this relates to the public health messaging in the aftermath of the Salisbury attack.
Yeah.
The family of Miss Sturgess have understandably wanted to know whether the authorities considered the possibility of there being a discarded container of Novichok after the Salisbury attack, and the risk of inadvertent contamination as a result. The inquiry has explored whether the message not to pick up any unidentified containers was shared with the public before the 30th of June 2018, and if not, why not? We have listened with care to Mr. Nichols' submissions on this issue and will address them in detail in our written submissions. Today, we say only this. The possibility of a discarded container and inadvertent contamination was considered before the 30th of June 2018. You've also heard Dame Sally Davies's clearly honest recollection that the Don't Pick It Up message was given at an early stage, but, as she acknowledges, the majority of the evidence suggests that the message was not issued until July 2018. The evidence has further shown that discussions about whether and how to issue such messages involve difficult and finely balanced judgments. Without evidence whether anything had been discarded, and if so, what and where, it would have been impossible to give specific warnings. More general ones risked causing confusion and anxiety. For example, no one could know whether the population of Salisbury should be warned, or people as far away as Heathrow. The focus was on giving clear messaging to those known to be at real risk, such as people who had been in Zizzi's. It is also important to note Commander Murphy's conclusion as to the most likely sequence of events. Recognising that this differs from the family's view described by Mr. Straw this morning, Commander Murphy's professional assessment was that Charlie Rowley picked up the perfume bottle from a bin on the 4th of March 2018 within a short time of Petrov and Bosharov poisoning the door handle. Mr. Rowley then held on to the bottle for some time and remembered it only on the 30th of June 2018. If this is correct, then you may think that any earlier Don't Pick It Up public health messaging would not have made a difference. If that is your finding, then there was no causative link to Dawn Sturgess's death. Finally, you have heard evidence from members of the public, paramedics and hospital staff who are not all represented before you today. The government would like to acknowledge the work that they did. Together, they managed to save 4 out of 5 critically ill patients in truly extraordinary circumstances and at considerable risk to their own personal safety. Dawn Sturgess was treated by people who had the skill and knowledge to save her, if saving her was possible. Tragically, as you have heard, she was exposed to an unsurvivable dose of Novichok, but everything that could have been done for her was done, and we hope that it is some comfort to her family to know that she was in the best possible hands. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Wolfe. Mr. O'Connor.
So that concludes the oral submissions from core participants.
Yes, thank you. Well, it brings these open hearings to an end, and I'd just like to make it clear how grateful I am to everybody who's helped make them work. The organisation of something like this doesn't happen by accident. It takes a good deal of care, and it takes a good deal of discipline on the part of all who take part. I'm grateful to those who've given evidence. I'm grateful to all counsel, and I don't make the mistake of assuming that those who haven't been on their feet have been inactive. I'm grateful to all the core participants, and chiefly, of course, to those most closely connected to the events, namely Dawn Sturgess's family, who've coped, if I may say so, admirably with what must have been, at times, extremely difficult evidence to listen to. And thank you also to those who've looked after me, some of you on your feet and some of you not. And I'm very conscious that the entire effort is supported by largely invisible and for that reason more effective support teams, document handling, people handling, transcripts, and all the technology that supports all those aspects. Thank you all very much indeed. As I say, it takes a degree of professionalism, and a high degree of professionalism, and for it I'm very grateful. Now, there's a good deal more to be done, which will appear A, uncertain, and B, disappointing to many who would like to see an outcome as soon as possible, amongst whom I may say I include myself. But the remaining processes which have to be gone through are extensive and of uncertain length. And even when a report has been drafted, I imagine most of you will understand that there remain considerable additional processes that have to be gone through before it or a revised version of it can be published. Accordingly, I cannot tell you, though I would like to be able to, when it will be. What I can tell you is that as far as I'm concerned, it'll be done as soon as it is humanly possible to do, and it will certainly be done within the course of the next year. And I hope to improve on that, but whether history allows me to do it or not remains to be seen. Thank you all very much. Some of you I shall see again at different times, and some of you, those of you who I shan't, as I say, I echo and renew the gratitude. It's very firmly meant. Thank you.
All rise.